on this computer. Right, we're now recording. Okay, now welcome everybody.
Okay, Griselda. Yeah, Griselda, could I just say, just before I fire away? Yep, no, that's all right. I've got the PowerPoint now. I can see that as well now. Good.
Excellent. Good. Okay, well, welcome everybody. Welcome to this very excellent presentation in the third Faversham Tree Week. And thank you so much for turning up and coming to hear our speaker, David Carey. He gave us a real-time walk around the churchyard a couple of weeks ago, which was absolutely fascinating. And he talked about it this morning, lunchtime at in 12 Marketplace. And so we're very lucky to have a repeat of that information this evening to be recorded. If you want to ask questions, either to unmute yourself and just ask, or you can put it in the chat and we'll deal with them a bit later on. And I think I just want to quickly say that at 7:30 tomorrow, Tim Ingram, who's here with us now, he's going to be talking about wood anemones as a marker of ancient woodlands. And on Thursday night, we have got Joe Barker talking about forest gardening and permaculture. So another very important aspect of tree life in the community. And I don't think I'm going to say very much more except to hand you over to David, who I'm absolutely delighted is our speaker tonight, so knowledgeable and encouraging. And it's been brilliant to get to know you a bit. And I'm so glad you can be our speaker for this evening. So without another word, over to you, David.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Griselda, and thank you very much for allowing me to sort of come over to Faversham and do a few things over there, and to do with trees. So just to introduce myself, I'm speaking wearing the hat today of Kent Tree and Pond Wardens, and I'm currently chairing that network of fine volunteers. And the local representative of the Kent Tree Wards is of course Vic Dickinson, who's on this call as well, and she's leading the group of Kent Tree Wardens who are working in Faversham, just starting up really in some ways, but really getting a grip of the situation in Faversham, thinking about planting trees, taking care of trees, and so on. And just to say that I will be in Faversham tomorrow morning between 10 and 11:30, and I'm going to bring my Wellington boots and my spade, because I think there's going to be the opportunity to actually plant trees in Faversham Recreation Ground, together with Swale Borough Council and so on, who I'm hoping will do all the hard work, and I'll just pose with my spade for photographs. At least that's the main plan. And there's also a launch of a really very, very good new guide to the trees of Faversham Rec that will be, I think, available tomorrow. So that's absolutely great. So kicking off with tonight's event, hopefully everybody can see a slide there, and I'm just going to minimize people's pictures so as I can see it as well. So what you should be seeing is the trees in the churchyard of St Mary of Charity, which is of course the parish church of Faversham. And I'm going to just sort of look a little bit about identity and biodiversity, and I'm just going to touch briefly. It'll be a quick scamper through some of these things, I think. So any more detail you want, either shout out or put your questions in the chat, and that will be great. So I'm thinking it's going to take about 40 minutes, maybe less, and time for questions either during or after. So wearing my tree warden's hat, here we go. The first tree that is particularly noticeable in the Faversham churchyard is actually in a small triangle of land just outside the main door to the west of Faversham Church, and near the south door where everybody sort of goes in and out. And this is rather amazing London plane. Now, I suspect that this has grown really well because it wasn't on the albumen photograph of about 1860 to 1880. So, it's possibly in the region of 100 years or so old, maybe a little bit older than that, but it's not really getting into the 150, 160 years old side thing. So it's really done quite well to attain the girth it is. And we've estimated it roughly at about 4 meters girth, something of that sort. But plane trees can grow very fast. Now, as the identity of this tree, it is, of course, London plane, which is a hybrid between the American plane, which actually doesn't do very well in our climate, and the European plane or Spanish plane, if you like. And this hybrid has therefore got a lot of hybrid vigor. It's got the flaking bark, so that's one of the factors that's always been used to explain its tolerance of pollution. And it was very, very popularly planted in the Victorian period of time in London and various other southern English cities, where it seems to do very well indeed, even in inner city conditions of poor soils, pollution, and of course being regularly cut back. And you can see that this particular example has been pollarded extremely heavily. So almost all the branches have been taken off the top at sort of classic pollarding height of about, 12 foot, about 4 meters, something of that sort. And we think this was actually done about 20 years ago, about the turn of the century, looking back at Google Earth Pro. And so all the foliage and all those sort of smaller branches up above there, they are ones that have grown since around, well, certainly no earlier than 1990 and no later than 2003. So around about the turn of the century. And you can see it's thrived and done really, really well for itself. London plane is the most remarkable tree. It exists in a number of different clonal forms. It's usually propagated clonally. And there's one called Hackney, and nobody knows where it comes from. All we know is that that particular type, that particular clone of London plane has been largely planted in the borough of Hackney and in just neighbouring boroughs and things of that sort. And there are about 20 or 30 really quite popular clones of the London plane that you'll find in London. I don't know which particular clone this particular London plane is, but it seems to share the general characteristics of this wonderful hybrid tree. And one of the things you will find is that if you look carefully on the underside of the leaves, you'll see these sort of patches. And this is caused by a leaf mining moth. And this is actually one that may have come into the country quite recently. And people can chip in if I get any of these facts wrong. But this, we think, is Phyllonectar platani. And it's a little caterpillar that burrows its way between the lower leaf and the lower leaf surface and the rest of the leaf, chews away at all the tissues and leaves these sort of slightly transparent lower epidermis in place, that you're translucent, I should say, that you can see in front of you. Now, the number of these tiny caterpillars growing on these leaves can be really quite significant. So, for example, I would say that on my local tree in Hadlow, you probably get an average of about 1 caterpillar every 2 leaves. And that's an awful lot of caterpillars when you think that there might be about 6,000 leaves on a tree, or maybe many more. And then you've got half that number or a third of that number of caterpillars. That's an awful big resource for birds and perhaps small mammals to feed on. This is the adult micro moth, Phyllonectar platani. This is a picture taken from the internet. It's not mine. It's really rather a beautiful little moth, very attractive, colorful thing. And of course, many of the caterpillars that survive will hatch out into these moths and again become food for either parasites or predators, depending on the individual fate. Pretty little thing, and very much part of a sort of ecological network building up around plane trees. Another little insect that you could sometimes find on plane is an American import. In about 2003, I think they first found this thing. The Americans call it sycamore lace bug because they call plane trees sycamores, and I wouldn't be at all surprised they call sycamores plane trees as well. And these tiny little bugs here suck on the sap and potentially weaken the tree. But again, they're probably going to be food for one of the birds or several species of bird and mammals. So another imported species of insect, and you often find this where you get an exotic tree coming in. It's often free of fairly fairly large numbers of pests and diseases, but these may build up over the time with imported bugs, and so it sort of becomes ecologically maybe more useful in food chains and things of that sort. And of course, this is a picture of the leaves all around that particular plane tree. And when the leaves fall down, they may still contain the insects that are feeding off the tree. And they also provide a lot of shelter for insects and other animals in the soil. So you'll often find blackbirds and things like that turning over the leaves and pulling them apart, searching for insects. And that's all part of the autumn sources of food that you will find. I always like to leave the leaves on my flower beds if I possibly can, because it encourages worms and all sorts of other things and gives cover to predatory insects like ground beetles, which eat slugs. So there's a whole little ecosystem builds up in the leaf litter, and sort of mimicking the forest floor, if you like. And just to emphasize that, here is a picture taken off the internet again. Most of the bird pictures, I'm afraid, are not mine, but they're just remembering that it's blackbirds in my garden that are mainly responsible for pulling leaves off my flower beds and returning them to the paths where I've carefully tidied them up from. Can be quite annoying in a little way, but of course feeding the blackbirds, either homegrown birds or birds come over from the continent in the winter period of time. Just next to that plane tree, there's a rather lovely, what I think is a Cotoneaster hybrid. I think it might be something related to Cotoneaster X Wateri, which is the Hilliers nursery hybrid. It's very popular and provides large numbers of berries. And of course, winter thrushes that are over from the continent will feed off these berries and perhaps descend on them. So this picture of a redwing, seen a couple of redwings, quite a few redwings already this winter, feeding off the berries of various types of shrub. And you'll see them as you drive around Kent. They'll often feed on the roadside shrubs that have been planted by Kent highways and so on. A beautiful, beautiful bird. I think it's very definitely my favorite thrush. The next tree along in the churchyard is this rather amazing old, almost completely hollow ash. Now, this is a weeping ash, and the weeping ash cultivar has been grafted onto a common ash trunk, and you can see the graft line around about 2 meters up off the ground, where the weeping ash trunk up above the graft line is a little bit more crinkled and rough, and a little bit wider as well. It's probably a little bit more vigorous than the common ash. And both sections are completely hollow. And so many of the upper branches were removed from that as a safety feature. And I'm really glad to see that at least some of the side branches were retained, because I think this might just have another cycle of pollinating within it. So I'm actually expecting that hollow trunk, which has still got live sapwood around it, to produce some new buds and to try and produce another branch framework. And then hopefully that will survive and feed the sapwood on this old tree until it becomes dangerous again, and hopefully, you know, then go through possibly even another cycle. Now, these old veteran trees, and they are classed as veteran, these trees, they've got loads of veteran features like hollowing branches, hollowing trunks and things of that sort. These are really important for biodiversity. And as Vic knows, we were looking at this, I think it was about June time or something like that this year, and it's entirely my fault. But I think I must have encouraged Vic to put a hand through that gap, or one of those gaps in the hollow trunk. And she was exploring where it was, and suddenly there was the most awful hullabaloo, and a stag beetle had actually sort of attached itself to her finger, drawing blood. And it's quite clear that this stag beetle had not read all the books, which tell you that stag beetles are completely harmless, because there was an awful lot of noise and drops of blood around, and it wouldn't let go. And we had to sort of tap it several times rather vigorously in order to get it off her finger. And it's a beautiful stag beetle. It really is a gorgeous insect, one of the largest beetles in the UK, if not the largest. And of course, at least partly protected by the Wildlife and Countryside Act. So it's lovely to see a rare insect in this old tree. This, of course, is the adult form, which may breed in around hollow trees of this sort, and the grubs then feed their way through the rotting wood on the inside of the trunk. So it just goes to emphasize, some of the biodiversity value in some of these older trees, of which more later. So moving on to some of the other ash trees in the churchyard, this is the next one along, a little bit further off towards the east. And this again is a massive trunk. It's 2.4 meters around, at least, I think, in girth. So, we're probably looking at 150 years or so, give or take my usual margin of 100 years error. And again, you can see that it's starting to hollow away and produce wonderful habitat in the middle, but still producing vigorous shoots, and will last for many years, hollowing away if properly treated and checked for safety. And that's one of the points I'm trying to make this evening, is that these old trees are incredibly valuable, both in biodiversity and historic terms. And really, we ought to be making every effort to treat them sympathetically in our tree safety assessments, and consider the value of the trees as well as any safety issues that they pose. Often the ash trees in various situations, particularly in this churchyard, seem to have a rather curious fixation on the hard landscaping near to them. So you can see that this cross has sort of fallen into the embrace of this particular ash tree, which is now trying to grow around the cross and actually envelop it. And it seems that callus reacts in some weird way. It seems to stimulate callus growth to sort of absorb and sort of drag in the hard stone material actually into the trunk. And if you look at the next ash tree along, you'll find that that one has actually sucked in a bit of railing. And this must have happened many, many decades ago, because that bit of railing now passes quite clearly through, if not quite the middle of the tree, fairly close to the middle of the tree. So goodness knows how that's happened. But you do get this with a variety of old trees, but ash seems to be particularly good at it. And there are several fine examples of the ash trees in this churchyard having absorbed various bits of hardware and so on, which is fascinating to see. Several of the other ash trees around are looking a little bit decrepit up above and probably need just a little bit of checking. But just a reminder, of course, that as in the trunk on the right, you can get woodpecker holes, perhaps, maybe taken over by nuthatches. And the sort of feature that you can see on the left could potentially maybe be useful for a roosting bat. And you can see possibly that various bats could use these sorts of features to roost in. It may be that bats only roost in a particular site for a night or two during the summer and autumn. But of course, there are some species of bat that will produce a wintering roost and maybe set up for most of the winter and spend their time within a tree of this sort. So before felling any of these trees, it's particularly important to check for whether they're suitable for bat roosts and consider whether actually you'd be committing a wildlife crime if you felled the roost. And the roost is protected throughout the year. So if you have evidence of bats roosting in a tree at one time of year, that means you should not be felling the tree without an English nature license. And then there's a whole paraphernalia that you need to go through for that, of which I will leave to the experts. So again, just to remember that this is the most likely woodpecker to have caused the holes in that particular tree in the churchyard, a great spotted woodpecker, again, a picture taken off the internet, and a picture of a bat. And I think that's a brown long-eared bat, but I wouldn't be absolutely certain. A sort of bat that sort of flits amongst trees in woodland, perhaps picking insects off the surface of leaves. And then some, if you look around the other ash trees in the churchyard, some of them show these what appear to be beetle exit holes. And I wouldn't know which beetle they are, but one possibility could be the ash longhorn beetle, of which these pictures here And again, the grubs grow within the decaying wood as the tree passes peacefully into old age, and then the adults emerge and breed in and around the trees. So it's actually a very sort of important part of life for many of the older trees. So Tim, I think, is asking at this point, very useful question. Do I think that many of these older trees were planted around the same time? And would the church have any records? So I don't know. This is something, you know, that's coming up. And Tim suggested maybe a similar time to plantings in the recreation ground. So the second half of the 19th century. And I think that sounds about right for the trees. So the one evidence we have is of a tree coming up in a bit, the holm oak. So I'll talk a little bit more about timing of that when we get to that, and see how we get on. And there we go, right. And this is the holm oak. Now, the reason that we think we know the age of this is that this tree is apparently the same tree as a young tree in this position, which looks like a holm oak. And the picture was taken somewhere between about 1860 or 1880. So if we center it about 1870, that makes the photo about 150 years old. And I would suggest that the tree in that particular albumen photograph is probably about 20 years old by about the time that the photo was taken. So we're estimating the age of this particular tree at about 170 years old, 1840 to 1860. And I would think that quite a few of the ash trees, and certainly the second ash tree we looked at, is around about the same age because it's actually in the background of the same albumen photograph. So we can't be sure about most of the others, but we think that the weeping ashes, the holm oak, and perhaps several of the sycamores and the very large lime tree that we'll come across later on are about that sort of age. So they're about 1 3/4 centuries year old, maybe, with a safety margin. Some of them may be older, some of them may be approaching 200 years in age, but it's very, very difficult to tell just from girth, circumference, or anything of that sort, because trees grow at such different rates. So one tree next to another can be twice the age of the other one, even if they're about the same girth. So it's difficult to tell from girth measurements. And of course, many of them start to lose their heartwood as they get older. So the older ones then become very difficult to measure by tree ring estimates. So it's always useful to have a bit of historical backup, rather like that albumen photograph, which would suggest something like 170 years old. Moving on, if we can just get that slide to move on. That oak tree has got what appears to be a Ganoderma, old Ganoderma fungus on it, which is potentially a few years old. You can see various layers of growth in that bracket, but it's not necessarily 1 year per growth ring, as it were. So a fungus like that may put on 2 growth rings, 2 layers a year, or may put on none in a particular year, depending on how hungry it's been and how good it's grown. But that fungus on the outside of the tree, not on its own a sign that the tree is dangerous by any means, but a sign, you know, that there is some hollowing out of the tree. And people always tend to worry when they see a single fungus bracket of that sort, that the tree is starting to hollow and therefore it's dangerous. But it's probably just worth remembering that as trees get older and do start to hollow, they end up as hollow cylinders. And that's really quite a strong system for defending the tree against torsional strain and so on. So a hollow cylinder is the sort of thing you make a scaffolding pipe out of, really very strong for its weight and really quite resistant to being blown over. So nothing to worry about at this stage until one sees the hollowing going beyond what one might call the safety margin. And this is why it's often a good idea for people who are responsible for veteran trees in churchyards or cemeteries, which are managed by borough councils and things like that, to actually get a specialist in veteran trees to decide on what's safe or otherwise, and what tree work can be done to retain the trees while they are safe. There's a whole variety of trees in this churchyard, most of which I've got in this slide, but some of which haven't. So just along the edge of this wall, about 10, 15 years ago, somebody's planted a line of about 4 or 5 Norway maples. And these are rather fine little trees. And they are planted fairly close to this wall, I think, possibly, a meter close to the wall than perhaps I might have thought necessary. And on the other side of the wall, there are these really young but quite large, swollen-based plane trees, and there's a line of about half a dozen of them, and they all seem to show the same characteristic of this sort of bottle butt or baobab tree effect, where the trunk of the tree is actually quite narrow high up, but the base of the tree is swollen. Nobody really knows what causes this, but they are quite regularly found in the district. So I've found some near Aylesford and so on the public parks near there. And of course, there are quite a few fine specimens in Canterbury, which apparently are arranged in a cross shape when you look at them from an aerial photograph. So they're quite nice to see just over the wall. But these Norway maple ones, I always find quite fine. And some friends of mine have done some work on aphids, and one of their photographs showing a sort of wingless apterous aphid, sort of older aphid, and some nymphal bodies around. And this one is Periphyllum or something like that, is the genus of the aphid here. And of course, very large numbers of these aphids then provide food source for birds like this robin. Again, not one of my pictures. This robin, looking curiously around for the next meal, can quite often take all sorts of different food sources and small insects and so on, and can pick up aphid eggs in the winter and things of that sort. A little bit further along in the churchyard, just past a rather fine Gelder rose, which I haven't got a picture of, but there's this rather lovely checkers tree. And of course, the checkers tree is one of these characteristic trees of southern England and of Kent. And it's rather a beautiful tree to see. It's got a lovely trunk and a lovely autumn color to it. And it's just sitting in the churchyard. And I always think it's lovely to go into churchyard and find all the different types of trees that somebody is, let's have one of those in our churchyard. And it all leads to the biodiversity and so on. So there's a picture of the checkers tree and fruit. And of course, the checkers fruit always used to be used for flavoring beer, is the story about it, and probably goes back to being a food source way back to, Neolithic times. And you can see some little gall mites on the underside of the leaves here. And again, the gall mites sort of can form food sources for various things and be part of their own food chains, either parasites or decay or predators and so on. So it's lovely to see one of these wild service trees or checkers tree, Sorbus torminalis, in the churchyard, and to see it as an extra diversity thing. And just a little bit further on from it, there's a lovely little rowan, but one does sort of worry when one tends to look down at the base and find these little chewing away things. I mean, it I suppose it could be bank vole or something like that, but in this situation, I'm pretty sure that it's more likely to be strimmer damage from over-enthusiastic use of strim. It's very difficult to avoid this sort of thing. If you're strimming all day long, listening to your headphones, it's very, very difficult to avoid damaging at least some trees as you pass. But it is something to be watched out for, and maybe we could try and think about some protection for the trunks of these particular trees in the churchyard, so that they grow through to a sustainable long life. And a little bit further along, horse chestnut, suffering from horse chestnut bleeding canker, which is by no means a death sentence for the tree, although you can see that this one's lost a major branch as well, but seems to, have survived and to be in the process of gradual healing. Often sapscars like these are particularly useful for some of the hoverfly adults, which particularly like sort of some of these liquid exudates from from trees. And this is just along the southeast corner of the churchyard. And again, it's nice to see one or two of these different types of trees scattered around the churchyard, providing biodiversity of insects, no doubt fungi in the soil, bacteria, and so on. Sorry, just passed a picture of a chaffinch there. This chaffinch is sort of one of the typical birds of the churchyard, and I did hear a couple. It was rather nice to see when I was taking all these photographs of the trees in the churchyard, and they were moving around and feeding on the ground, which is where they prefer to feed, really, and then flying up into the trees, as unfortunately I accidentally disturbed them. So just next to that, there is this cluster of stems of a hawthorn, and this, drew my attention because you've got this cluster of stems. When you look down at the base, this is actually an extremely old tree that is behaving like a phoenix tree. So you can see an old trunk there, which has fallen over almost horizontally. It's split in half. It really must have been quite an old tree when it fell. But even when it fell, it has recovered and has all these new young stems appearing. So if you look at this tree as a whole, then it's actually quite an old tree. So we're classing it as a veteran tree on the basis of the diameter of the old trunk, and it's a really beautiful example of tree regeneration, which is perhaps not unsuitable, for a churchyard setting, and a resilient and regrowing tree. And Tim, I think, has just added that very useful comment that if you have a tree which could potentially be subject to strimmer damage, if I've interpreted his comment correctly, why not plant some bulbs in a ring around the trunk and thus deter the over-enthusiastic strimmer, and just provide that tree with a little bit of barrier. It's exceptionally useful, and Tim may follow that up either now or later. So this is one of the trees that I worry about because it doesn't look very much from a distance. So, if I go back to that previous slide there, you might not recognize it as an important and veteran tree, but in fact it is, and one well worth preserving. And of course, for its biodiversity thing, this is actually on blackthorn, I think, but it's just a reminder that many blue tits actually seem to peck away at the flowers of rosaceous trees in spring, and it seems they may be after nectar. They do seem to be sort of poking their beaks into the cups of the trees. I don't know whether anybody else has seen that, but I've seen that myself, particularly along a hedgerow in my own parish, where there is a line of blackthorn or cherry, and the blue tits can always be found there feeding off the flowers in the spring. So just another way of getting food out of trees, perhaps. And of course, in the autumn and the winter, we get the invading or overwintering winter thrushes, such as this gorgeous field fare, again, a picture off the internet, not one of mine, and this feeding off the haws of the hawthorn. And quite often, you'll find quite a few thrushes will do this on various different types of trees. So the sorbus in my back garden, rather similar possibly to the sorbus we saw in the churchyard here, often stripped in my garden by blackbirds, which also take the haws off the hawthorn at my back edge. And one year I was lucky enough to actually have waxwings in my garden feeding off the haws of the hawthorn. So who knows, if we keep an eye on the hawthorns in Faversham churchyard, who knows what we will see. This is another tree just going around the corner, going around the churchyard anti-clockwise, or widdershins, which is perhaps not the best thing to do in a churchyard. You should really go clockwise, the conventional way. But this is an absolutely massive lime tree at the sort of northeast corner of the churchyard. And you can see its top's been taken out. And then the horizontal branches, horizontalish branches off to one side, they have grown upwards, almost like water shoots on an apple tree, or there's a Japanese form of tree management which shows a similar sort of growth period. There's a huge tree with very heavy side branches here, and a huge number, a gigantic canopy with a huge number of leaves on it. And that's close up at the trunk. Again, it's big enough to be classified as a veteran tree, and it does seem to be a common lime. There are some sprouts at the base, and from the leaf characteristics, I'm thinking common lime, but possibly back crossed towards small leaf. That's a possibility. And there are various different clones of common lime, of course. And then on the leaves of one of the lime trees in the churchyard, I found these little leaf miners, which I think are, and forgive my Latin pronunciation, Buculatrix thoracica, or something rather similar to that, which again is one of these leaf mining moths, and caterpillar makes these very characteristically shaped mines in the leaves, and then goes on to chew away at the leaf window paning it in its later stages, and then pupates both in between larval stages, and as it pupates it forms proper pupa as it goes into the adult stage. And this is a picture of the adult Buculatrix moths. With, if I got that right, I think one of the common names for the group is bent wing micro moth, and you can see this sort of tendency to fluff up at the back. And it's a gorgeous little thing, and so interesting to see all these different little specialist species of things feeding on the different types of tree in the churchyard. And of course, lots of these little insects are loved by the insectivorous birds. And here's a picture of a wren off the internet, which will often take little insects and a whole variety of foods and so on. And it's probably worth remembering that even seed-eating birds do seem to supplement the diet of their chicks and so on in the very early stages with insect food. So useful to have opportunities in the churchyard for the insect growth as we've seen. And then this is one of the weirdest looking elders that I've seen. It's very sort of S-shaped trunk to it. Unfortunately, it split apart this gravestone perhaps many decades ago. But elder, very much a tree of mystery and magic, you might say. And of course, very, very useful in its own right for biodiversity. And the elderberries are reputedly fed on very large numbers by migrating warblers such as blackcaps and so on. So very useful to have those berries ripening up just that time when birds are feeding up, ready on blackberries and so on, ready for their migration south towards Africa. And here's a picture of a goldfinch, which I think is nesting in an elderbush. So just to remind me that there are nesting opportunities in the trees there, for as well as feeding opportunities for all the birds. And then this is the one large yew tree in the churchyard that is actually quite heavily buried. So this is a female tree, and sort of sex, or if you prefer gender, I'm never quite sure, in trees is often a fairly fluid thing. And you do get trees and yews that appear to be quite male, and trees that appear to be quite female, and trees that aren't quite sure, and trees that may be in transition. But this one certainly seems to be lots and lots of berries on it. And this is one of the favorite foods of missel thrush. So again, a picture off the internet of missel thrush. And quite often, if you go into a churchyard, you find a buried tree of this sort, and you just wait for about 20 minutes, you will hear that rattling call of a missel thrush. And sure enough, they're there in Faversham churchyard, feeding off that particular tree and feeding off the berries. It seems to be one of their delights. And it seems that when they've gorged their fill, because they do seem to eat the yew berries, to excess, and then they may move away from the tree and are quite often sick. And you find these little patches of missel thrush vomit, as it were, with bits of yew berries in. And this possibly helps to spread the seeds and so on. And it's certainly true in the cemetery in my own local village. And then there are a few birch trees in the churchyard, and birch trees are often full of features such as cracks and hollowing branches and things of that sort. And Faversham churchyard is no exception, offering us plenty of opportunities for insects and wildlife, and possibly all sorts of other things to hide in between. And of course, many of the insects that feed off the leaves. And there's a rather beautiful shot of the birch tree in the that would be the northwest corner of the churchyard there, and probably one of the more architectural sort of landscapey parts of the churchyard, of the birch tree up against various oak trees and so on. So just coming towards the end of the circuit of the church that we're doing, we come across an exotic tree, and this, of course, is the handkerchief tree. And this particular individual tree was planted in Faversham churchyard in memory of the Queen Mother. And so it's very nice to see them. Very, very nice tree. Not in itself much good, perhaps, for insects to feed on, being a non-native tree and so on, but a very nice landscape addition to the churchyard, and always nice to see a few pretty trees. I've missed out quite a few individual species of tree, including a rather lovely empress or foxglove tree down in the southeast corner of the churchyard, which is beautiful, purpley, I don't know quite the word, purpley mauve color when it's in flower. And so it's nice to have that diversity of view within the churchyard as well. So here we are, we're back now at the west door of the church, the main door of the church, which actually is not actually commonly used for entry and exit anymore. And we're looking towards the north, and we've got this line of English oaks there on the extension part of the churchyard to the west. And the English oak, of course, full of different English species, and really very valuable for biodiversity. And just in that patch, oh, yeah, I should say, caterpillars, of course. I haven't mentioned any caterpillars, and that is criminally negligent of me. So here's an oak tortrix caterpillar, Tortrix viridana, which can exist in huge numbers in oak trees, sort of early in spring, and are very commonly eaten by a range of birds, and very interesting ecology to do with all the tannins that the oak leaves produce, of course. Skip through, and then just mention mammals. Of course, I haven't really talked about mammals eating insects, but the common shrew, I believe, is the second commonest mammal in the UK. I wonder whether that's apart from us, really, but quite often, you will find small mammals living in churchyards of this sort, and quite a diversity, which you can find by longman trapping and so on. And I wouldn't be surprised if they're there in reasonable numbers in the churchyard. So we've got the birds, we've got the bats, we've got the mammals on the ground, maybe, and very often missed. You don't often see them. You might hear a rustle at this time of year and amongst the leaves on the ground. And I always remember as a child hearing little animals rustling through leaves, and then being sure that I'd be able to spot them, and never once seeing them. Very frustrating. So there we are. And then just on the western side, there's absolutely gigantic sycamore, and this is a huge tree and must have an incredible number of aphids on it. So very much part of the ecological base. And then this last picture of the internet here, and again, this comes from my Friendly Aphid Hunters website, and I just love this picture because it shows an adult ladybird feeding off what appears to be an aphid body there on that side, and really quite a tough-looking aphid. And what it's done, apparently, it's actually snipped off the wings of the adult aphid that you can see there as it's grabbed the aphid, possibly while it was feeding off the leaf. And it's actually really quite neatly removed the leaves, the wings of the aphid, so as it can get at the body of the aphid more easily. And most amazing picture taken by Ben there. And just show, this is an aerial photograph of the ancient tree inventory. So it's a satellite photo showing where the trees that have already been identified as veteran trees, marked in green. So if we go anti-clockwise from the west side, we've got that triangle of land there with the plane tree on. We've got that hollow weep trunk of the old weeping ash there, just slightly to the southeast of that. Below that, we've got the holm oak, and then moving east, we've got another of the big ash trees. Must be certainly 170 years old at least, that particular one. Then we've got that phoenix hawthorn there, and then moving up towards the northeast of the site, we've got very large sycamore on the boundary, which I've classified at the moment as notable, but it's probably a veteran as well. And then the last note up there that's recorded on this ancient tree inventory, that very large lime tree that we saw earlier on, again classified as veteran. It's got enough veteran features to do that. So as the age of all these trees, probably in the region of 170, maybe some of them 200 years old, would be my guess. But my guess is notoriously wrong. So, you can make what you will of that. So these are important trees, and the sort of definition of veteran trees and ancient trees is those that are effectively irreplaceable in planning terms. So if you're planning to build some houses there and somebody pointed out to you that there were veteran or ancient trees there, it'd be the same sort of level of interest as ancient woodland, and you would have a good reason for saying don't cut them down and build your house there, because that is irreplaceable historically and habitat wise, and leave enough space for them to live out the last century or so of their lives, whatever may be left to them. And just to remind myself, you do get all sorts of things wandering through churchyards, and I'm reliably informed that foxes are regularly seen in this particular churchyard, probably looking for all sorts of food and things of that sort. So that's what my quick scamper through some of the individual trees of the parish church of Faversham, St Mary of Charity, and some of their diversity. Not all the trees I've identified, but hopefully enough to give us a little bit of a taste of the number of trees that's there and their identity and diversity, and some of the biodiversity, some hints at the biodiversity that variety of trees would provide. So over to the expert, please. What have I missed out? What haven't I said? What other comments would people like to make about the trees in Faversham churchyard?
David, that's absolutely the most amazing sort of, I feel very rapid a gallop round that amazing piece of land there. You were talking about bats, and I just wanted to say that the town council, I think, are minded to help us fund bat boxes. Now, would you advise those to be put actually onto trees, or do you think they should go into the building itself somewhere? What's your best advice for bat boxes?
Well, I am a member of the Kent Bat Group, but by no means an expert member. And I think it does rather depend on the species of bat. So I'm going to leave it up to the experts to say, but it's a fairly classic thing when you have old trees to put bat boxes up in the trees themselves. It does rather depend, Griselda, on the species of bat and also how the bats are going to use them. So, for example, if you're looking at encouraging a maternity roost of something like pipistrelles or long-eared bats, they really quite like the warmth and shelter of a building out of the way of storms and cold winds and things like that. Because when you're doing a maternity roost, the idea is you need the warmth, for the pups and things of that sort. On the other hand, if you're looking for a winter roost of a woodland bat, they'd actually quite like a cool temperature, which is quite steadily cool and something of that sort. So I would have thought the church wouldn't be suitable for that sort of thing. And, it'd be much better to have a winter roost in the trees, or of course in the caves and things like that, where the temperature is quite steadily down at about 10 Celsius or below, or things of that sort. So I think my best answer to your question, Griselda, is both. Yeah. Anybody else like to pick me up on any of the errors that I will have undoubtedly made in that gallop, because I've been rushing through it? Is that of any interest to anybody?
Yes.
Definitely.
I think there are many more experts who can tell you all about, different types of trees and biodiversity. What I've tried to do today is sort of say, look at all that expert information, think about it in terms of Faversham churchyard and the wonderful value it provides to the town in terms of these very large trees with such diversity of life in and associated with them.
Would you say that there was room in that churchyard for more tree planting without crowding out what's already there?
I wouldn't think it's a great priority at the moment, myself. And there are a couple of sort of gaps, but we all know that glades are really quite important in sort of woodland settings, and it's rather nice to have that bit of open ground. So if you remember when we were looking at that birch tree up against the oak trees, there was a bit of open ground there, and there is just to the east of the lime tree as well. And I've got a feeling, and again, I'm subject to correction by the experts, but just looking at the leaves of some of the plants there, I've got a feeling that that's where you might be able to find some lesser meadow rue, which is a herbaceous plant, which quite likes open space. And there's something that looked awfully like what I thought was lesser meadow rue there. So it's not, I wouldn't describe it as a rare plant, but it's an unusual plant. And perhaps Tim could, go and see, go and have a look at it and tell me whether it is or it isn't. There are a few remnants of flowers on it, Tim, but maybe not enough to be absolutely sure. Lesser meadow rue, quite a rare native plant, well, an unusual native plant, possibly more unusual than it used to be. But of course, it is sometimes planted in churchyards, I understand, as an act of remembrance and signifying grief and memory and memories and all the rest of that. So it's quite sweet to find, but certainly very definitely recordable, according to Sue Buckingham of the Kent Botanical Recording Group.
Marvelous. Are there more questions from anybody?
Can I ask, you mentioned there being other videos on YouTube. What are the other ones?
We've managed to record a talk about bushcraft, which was Hannah Nichols, who runs a business called Natural Pathways, where she takes both adults and children and shows them how they can live in the woods without doing damage and actually foraging and so on. A very redemptive kind of activity she has. It was a very, very interesting talk. So that's up there. And then what was the other one? My brain's gone. It's sitting.
Irish farming.
Of course,
Irish farming.
Susanna Crampton, who farms in Ireland. Her family has been on this farm since about 1800, and every generation has planted trees in this beautiful farm, and she is absolutely passionately devoted to biodiversity using agroforestry and so on. So there are 2 recordings that were made within the last week, and this recording will be on there as well, and the ones that we've got coming up later on this week. So they'll sit there as a little archive of tree-based discussions.
Will there be something, because I'm really interested about the trees on the wreck, but your talk is on during a working day for me. So I just wondered if there's going to be anything like this.
Not this year. You can go and get.
Can I pick that up, Griselda?
Yes, we can certainly do something about that.
Griselda, could I pick that up?
Yes, sure.
Yeah. Because if you have a look on the Faversham Tree Group Facebook page, or we could send you a copy of the programme. First of all, there's the tree planting and the issuing of the tree guide, Tara, which is absolutely brilliant tree guide, which Ben Simon is launching tomorrow, of 21 or more trees in Faversham Wreck, and really very well written. So showing you around the wreck. And then he's doing winter tree identification, I think, on the Thursday, and a walk on heritage trees in the wreck later on, which will probably cover the tree guide. So yeah, I'm
just a pity
whether that's on the.
It's the working day, isn't it? It's a pity.
Well, this is the trouble. But what we could do is maybe next year, with a bit more preparation, because this is all done on a voluntary basis, really, we can ask whether they'd be willing to do a Zoom presentation next time around, so that it is recorded. And I know they're doing a lot of planting there, and I think they're very proud of what they're doing. They're doing some great work there, actually.
Yeah. No, it's really interesting. Thank you very much.
Okay.
Oh, you're very, very welcome. And it's been, and it's just such a wonderful churchyard. Many of the churchyards in Swale are. I think they're absolute gems. Sometimes in the middle of town, sometimes out in the countryside with the most amazing ancient yew trees in. And I'm so glad to see that the Church of England and several other churches have joined together to think about the two sort of connected projects were of God's Acre, which is the idea of looking at biodiversity of churchyard, and of Eco Church, which is a bigger project to do with sustainability of church activities, but also including the biodiversity of churchyards. And in the first week of June, I think it is the first week of June every year, hopefully, you know, it's always useful to get out the Sunday schools and so on to go around and just sort of see what sort of biodiversity is in the churchyard, and that's a whole week long of activities called Count for Nature or Count on Nature, which the churches organise. So it's so great to see these initiatives going on in churchyards. Wonderful.
If anybody is free on Friday at 1:30, David will be leading a walk around the rather extraordinary Abbey Physic Garden, which is just down that little alleyway in front of the church that you saw, that little pathway. It's an ancient salters track, and there are some very, very interesting trees there. There's a mulberry growing over the hedge, a black mulberry, and a medlar trees and all sorts of interesting things there. So there will be a walk around that garden at 1:30 on Friday, if you're free to come along. There's a lovely old stone gate in the wall next to the old grammar school.
Well, thanks ever so much, Griselda. That's been really interesting questions and so on, and so nice to see everybody.
Do we need a special link to find? If you go to YouTube and just look for Faversham Trees, you'll find the channel there, and there are some recordings from last year and the two from this week, and we'll put this one up. I'll put it up there tomorrow, I expect. So you just look for Faversham Trees on YouTube and you should find it. And I'll put links on the Facebook group as well. So, okay, well, that's it then. Thank you very, very much indeed to everybody for turning up. And thank you hugely to David. What a wonderful talk. It's like having a gold mine. It's just wonderful. Thank you.
It's a very, very low level whiz round. Mr. Badman can answer all your questions on insects.
Certainly not. I think I've thoroughly enjoyed your talk this evening. It's been very good.
Right.
Thank you, John. That's very kind.
Well, goodbye. Thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you. Smash it. Be good.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye.